So, Lady Colin Campbell just said the quiet part out loud. And honestly, she didn't even flinch when she said it, on live television. When a presenter asked her whether Meghan Markle would eventually go after a Jeff Bezos type of billionaire, Lady C didn't push back. She didn't defend. She accepted the premise entirely, and only corrected the timing. And the reason that one small correction is echoing through royal circles right now is honestly more revealing than anyone expected, because we're not talking about another tabloid jab or a throwaway line on a chat show. We're talking about a coordinated shift in tone from the people who've watched this story closest for the longest, and they are now saying something out loud that until recently they'd only whispered. That's not gossip, that's a consensus forming in real time. And when Angela Levin, who spent 2 years inside Harry's life writing his biography, tells a national audience that Meghan has been chasing very rich men for some time, and remains with Harry only because she hasn't yet found the right person, that's not institutional caution. That's an accusation dressed up as observation. Before we get into it, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the updates on this one, because the story is still moving, new names are being dropped every week on air, and what Lady C said is only the tip of what's coming. So let's talk about what actually happened here, because the timeline is pretty revealing when you lay it all out. Long before Meghan Markle ever met Prince Harry, she had, according to Tom Bower's book Revenge, told her own London agent that she'd Googled him and gone deeply into his life. That agent was Gina Nelthorpe Cowan, who represented her in London for roughly 2 years, and the detail is reportedly not vague. It's specific. It's stated as a fact that Meghan volunteered herself, apparently without prompting, about a man she hadn't yet met. And I know a Google search sounds like nothing in 2015. Everybody Googles everybody, but when you place that comment inside a longer sequence, it starts to look less like idle curiosity and more like preparation, because the sequence starts earlier than most people realize. In 2012, a man named Marcus Anderson, who ran global membership for Soho House, reportedly became her patron in Toronto. That's the word Tina Brown used later, patron, and Tina Brown is not a light source. She's the former editor of Vanity Fair and Tatler, and when she described Soho House as a glide path into a newly porous world of shortcut social climbing, she wasn't being poetic, she was describing an actual mechanism. Soho House, for anyone unfamiliar, is a private members club with branches in most major cities, and access to it in the 2010s functioned like a passport into a very specific kind of transatlantic elite. Politicians, financiers, actors, journalists, and now here's the thing. A basic cable actress from a legal drama shot in Toronto doesn't normally get patroned into that room. Someone opens the door for her. And in 2012, Anderson reportedly did exactly that. Then in 2014, that same basic cable actress was seated as a counselor at One Young World in Dublin. And I know that sounds incredibly boring, but stay with me, because it's actually the key. One Young World is a global summit for young leaders, and the counselors are typically Nobel laureates, heads of state, senior diplomats. She was seated alongside Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland. That's not nothing. That's a placement that requires someone, somewhere, to have made a call. And nobody has fully explained who made that call. What's known is that by the time she was sitting on that panel, the trajectory had already begun to accelerate. Then comes the detail that changes everything. At 1 in the morning, on the 11th of September 2015, an unprompted message reportedly reached Piers Morgan. He kept the screenshot. Morgan has since said publicly, more than once, that the message came out of nowhere from a woman he'd never met, and that within weeks he was meeting her for a drink at a pub near Kensington. And here's where it gets interesting, because the pattern in that year, according to the people who lived through it, was consistent. A message here, a coffee there, a dinner introduction, always upward, always toward someone who could open a door. And then Harry, and then Windsor, and then the wedding in 2018, where two of the most experienced royal chroniclers alive, Tom Bower and Tina Brown, went at the guest list separately, and reportedly came back with the same finding. Friends of the groom, close friends, men Harry had served with, men he'd grown up next to, were quietly left off. Hollywood contacts, agents, brand managers, and figures Meghan had known for a matter of months were put on. That's a pretty remarkable rearrangement of a groom's own wedding, and it's the kind of detail that at the time was written off as bridal preference. Looking back now, with everything that's followed, it reads differently. Now here's where the contradiction starts to emerge between what Meghan was projecting publicly and what was reportedly happening behind closed doors. Publicly, the story in 2018 was one of a woman leaning into service. Patronages, which for anyone new to this vocabulary means official charitable roles carried out on behalf of the monarchy, were being lined up. There was SmartWorks, there was the National Theatre, there was talk of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And honestly, that's hard to argue with. She was showing up, she was doing engagements, which are the official duties royals perform on behalf of the crown. From the outside, the ark looked clean. But here's the thing. Insiders describe a very different picture forming inside Kensington Palace during that same period. Aides reportedly found themselves managing not one duchess but two competing operations. And the tension wasn't over ideology, it was over direction. Was this a woman settling into an institution, or was this a woman using an institution as a launchpad? And I understand the instinct to give her the benefit of the doubt on that. Anyone marrying into that family would want to hold on to their own identity. Anyone would push back on being flattened into a role. That's a legitimate impulse. But the pattern that 6 named former friends have since described, in interviews and in on-the-record accounts, is not about identity preservation. It's about proximity to power, and the discarding of people once that proximity was secured. That's the third-party ripple almost nobody talks about. 6 former friends. 6 women who at various points in the previous decade had been close enough to be at birthdays, at dinners, at introductions. And by 2019, according to reporting collated by British and American outlets, they were describing the same trajectory. A phase of intense closeness, a phase of usefulness, and then a quiet fade. One of them reportedly said she realized she'd been dropped only when she saw a photograph of an event she hadn't been invited to and understood the room had moved on without her. That's not a falling out. That's a pattern. And here's where it gets interesting. Because the same year those women started speaking, according to those briefed on the Los Angeles social scene, something else began. The rich and famous, the actual A-tier of Hollywood and Silicon Valley, reportedly started shutting the Sussexes out. Not publicly, not with statements, just with the slow, brutal social mechanics of not returning calls, not extending invitations, not showing up to the events that were being hosted. Palace observers said at the time that the Montecito operation had been built on the assumption of a rolling guest list of household names. What actually developed, according to the same observers, was a much thinner rotation of second-tier figures, publicists, and podcast contacts. That's the detail I honestly can't stop thinking about. Because if the initial theory was that the couple were building a global brand on the backs of the world's most powerful people, and those powerful people have quietly declined to participate, then the entire commercial thesis of the post-royal life is under strain. And that's the context in which Angela Levin's comments landed. She wasn't speaking into a vacuum, she was speaking into a room that had already noticed the ceiling. Let me set the scene of what she actually said, because it matters. Levin, on a program watched by hundreds of thousands, said calmly, in the tone of someone stating something she considered established fact, that Meghan had been chasing very rich men for some time. She said Meghan remains with Harry only because she hasn't yet found the right one. That's a pretty remarkable admission from a biographer who once had access to the family, and who is known in royal circles as measured, rather than sensational. On the same program, a presenter said openly that there had been meetings with billionaires in Los Angeles. No name was given. No date was pinned down. But the phrasing was flat. It was said as if it were already known. And then Paul Burrell, Princess Diana's former butler, added his own prediction, that Meghan's next step is a billionaire. Burrell has his critics, and his history with the family is complicated, but he spent years inside those walls, and his instinct on the internal weather of that world has been correct more often than not. And when Lady Colin Campbell was asked directly on Talk TV whether Meghan would go after a Jeff Bezos type, she did the one thing nobody expected. She didn't argue with the premise, she accepted it. She only pushed back on when it would happen. Now, that's 4 separate commentators, all with their own audiences, all with their own reputations to protect, converging on the same forecast in the same fortnight. If that's true, then what we're watching isn't a media pile-on. It's a hypothesis being tested in public, and the people testing it are the ones who've had the longest view. Now here's where the contradiction sharpens. Because on the other side of this, and I want to be fair to it, is Harry. And Harry, by every account, still believes in the marriage. Insiders describe a man who has spent the last 5 years defending his wife with a ferocity that has cost him his father, his brother, his country, and most of his closest childhood friends. And honestly, that's hard to argue with too. That's not a man playing a role. That's a man who has burned every bridge behind him because he believes the woman standing next to him is worth it. That's real. That's not performance. Nobody who watches him closely doubts the sincerity of his commitment. But here's the thing. Sincerity on one side of a marriage doesn't guarantee symmetry on the other. And the question the commentators are now asking, out loud, on national television, is whether the symmetry was ever there. Whether the man who gave up everything was matched by a partner who was giving up anything at all. And it's a brutal question. It's the kind of question that families do not ask each other over dinner. But it's the question that Levin and Campbell and Burrell are now placing on the table in front of an audience of millions. There's a scene that was described to a British columnist earlier this year, and I keep coming back to it. A senior figure in the Sussex Montecito operation, an aide by role, was reportedly sitting across a desk from someone who had known Meghan in Toronto a decade earlier. The aide had a folder on the desk. Inside the folder, according to the account, were talking points for an upcoming media appearance, and the older acquaintance leaned forward and asked quietly whether any of the friends from before were still around. The aide reportedly didn't answer. She just closed the folder and slid it to one side. That's the moment that changed something inside that room, because the silence answered the question more clearly than any sentence could have. And that folder is the recurring object in all of this, because insiders describe folders like it in every stage of the story. A folder of contacts Marcus Anderson maintained in Toronto. A folder of introductions that led to One Young World. A folder of guest list revisions before Windsor. A folder of pitches now being circulated in Los Angeles. Always a folder. Always a curated list. Always names moving on and names moving off. That's not a coincidence. That's a method. So why did the Hollywood door start closing? That's the question that hasn't been answered clearly. And it's the one Lady C's comments implicitly answer. Because if you accept the premise that the operation was built on access, then the moment access stops flowing outward and starts costing the people who grant it, the operation stops working. According to those briefed on the Los Angeles social calendar, the tipping point came somewhere in late 22 and early 2023, when several of the biggest names in tech and entertainment reportedly declined to attend events the couple were associated with. Once one declines, the others notice. Once the pattern sets, it hardens. And by the time it hardens, you're not on the guest list anymore. You're the guest list nobody accepts. That brings us to what people inside those circles are now calling the breaking point. And it plays out not in one dramatic scene, but in a slow, sustained pressure that reportedly built through this year. The setting, as described by observers, is a house on a hill in Montecito. The room, a living room with tall windows. The moment, an evening in early spring when a scheduled call with a potential collaborator, a figure described only as a senior executive at a major streaming platform, reportedly did not happen. The call had been on the calendar for weeks. The prep had been done, and at the hour it was meant to begin, no call came. And then no rescheduling came. And then, according to the account, the executive's office went quiet altogether. Harry, according to the same account, was in the room when the silence stretched past the hour. He didn't say anything at first. He removed his glasses. He put them on the arm of the chair. He covered his face with his hand for a long moment. Meghan, sitting across from him, reportedly didn't retreat. She didn't try to soften it. She said, in a low voice, that they'd been counting on the wrong people. And then she said something else. She said, according to the person who described the scene, that they were going to have to reach higher, not sideways, higher. That's the line that reframes the story. Reach higher, because higher in a Montecito living room in 2025 doesn't mean another streaming executive. It doesn't mean another podcast host. Higher means the men whose names Angela Levin was implicitly gesturing toward. The men the presenter mentioned in Los Angeles. The men Lady Colin Campbell accepted the premise of without argument. That's a pretty remarkable admission from someone who is publicly still committed to a marriage. And it's a line that, if the account is accurate, tells you why the commentators feel confident forecasting what they're forecasting. His voice reportedly rose once during that evening, and then it stopped. He didn't finish the sentence he'd started. He looked at the window. She said his name once, softly, and then the room went quiet again, and the folder that had been sitting on the coffee table, the one with the prep for the call that never came, was reportedly closed and moved to a shelf. That folder is still there, according to the person who described the scene. It has not been reopened. The aftermath of moments like that doesn't stay inside the house. It moves outward, and it moves fast. Within days of Levin's comments and Lady C's on-air remarks, British broadcast outlets picked up the framing and ran with it. Headlines in the tabloids, panel discussions on morning television, radio phone-ins in which callers, both older and younger, weighed in with sharply different reactions. Older citizens, according to the audience research shared publicly by 2 networks, felt the commentary confirmed suspicions they'd held quietly for years. Younger demographics viewed it as another episode of a media establishment refusing to let a woman of color define her own narrative. Both reactions were real. Both were held with conviction. And in the middle of that split, there was one small human detail that landed for me and I think will land for a lot of people watching. A father in a village in Norfolk was reportedly seen reading a printed article about the story to his adult daughter over Sunday lunch, and when he got to the line about the 6 named former friends, his daughter, who had been defending Meghan for years, put her fork down and asked him to read it again. He did. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she said one word. She said, "Oh." That's the reaction that scares the Sussex operation more than any headline, because "oh" is the sound of a supporter starting to move. The public gesture, if you can call it that, came not in the form of blue stars at Windsor or a handwritten note pinned to a gate, but in something quieter. On social media, in the days after Lady C's Talk TV appearance, several accounts that had spent years defending the couple reportedly went quiet, not deleted, not deactivated, just quiet. That's a form of ripple too. It's the ripple of a base beginning to reconsider. And here's the reframe that matters. Palace observers close to the Windsor operation have said, on background, that the increasing willingness of commentators to speak plainly is not being driven by a desire to punish Meghan. It's being driven by a concern for Harry. This scrutiny was reportedly taken up to protect him from a trajectory his defenders believe he cannot see clearly, not to humiliate a woman for reaching for more. Whether you accept that framing or not, it's the framing the people saying these things claim to hold. And it changes how you hear the sentences. It doesn't make them softer, it arguably makes them harder, because they're being said by people who believe they're doing him a kindness. Now here's the thing that I keep coming back to. If the forecast is wrong, if Meghan and Harry remain together for the next 30 years, if the Montecito operation stabilizes and the marriage endures and the commentators are eventually proven to have been catastrophically off base, then this whole conversation will look, in hindsight, like a cruelty. And that possibility has to stay on the table. Marriages defy predictions all the time. People change. Circumstances shift. The people closest to a couple are often the last to see the ways in which that couple is quietly holding each other up. But if the forecast is right, if the trajectory the 6 former friends described in Toronto and London is the same trajectory playing out now in Los Angeles, then what Lady C said on air was not a provocation, it was a prediction, and predictions in this world have a way of aging into records. That's what makes this moment strange to watch. We are watching, in real time, a group of experienced observers place a bet on a marriage in public, and the person whose life is most at stake in that bet is a man who reportedly still believes, deeply and sincerely, in the woman across from him. What this whole situation illuminates, honestly, is the oldest tension in that family, and maybe in any family. Duty versus love. Silence versus honesty. Institution versus person. Harry chose love. He chose it loudly and completely and at enormous personal cost. And nobody who watches him closely can doubt the sincerity of that choice. But love, as the people around him are now saying out loud, doesn't guarantee reciprocity. And when the people who've watched you longest start speaking the same sentence at the same time, that sentence deserves at least to be heard. The folder is still on the shelf in Montecito. The call was never rescheduled. The 6 friends have not returned. And the commentators, one by one, are saying the same thing. That's where we are. That's the record as it stands. Before we wrap up, if you want to stay updated on royal family news as it develops, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.